Today we're going to make a circle skirt with a stretch waistband. Stretch waistbands are awesomely comfortable, but they're also super easy to make because you don't have to fuss around with zippers or buttons or any of that nonsense. Step 1 is to go to whatthecraft.com/shop and download this handy dandy circle skirt guide that I've made. Then you can go ahead and cut it out. Next, you want to measure your waist, and depending on where you prefer to wear your skirts, that could be your low waist or your natural waist, just measure where you want the waistband to hit you. I want my sample to fit a waist of 32 inches. The waistline of a circle skirt has a lot of stretch to it, even if you're using a non-stretch fabric, because of the bias of the fabric. So to counteract that, we're actually going to cut it a little small. Since I want a 32-inch waist, I'm going to use the 30-inch marker. I'm going to make a paper pattern first. You could go straight to fabric, but I like making a paper pattern because it's kind of like a first draft. People ask a lot about pattern paper. I don't buy pattern paper because I'm a cheapskate. I use whatever I have lying around. So we're going to take our guide and mark around that edge. The next thing you need to figure out is how long you want your skirt. I'm shooting for 17 inches. I'm going to have a 2-inch waistband, so I'm looking for 15 inches for the length of the actual circle portion of my skirt. And then I'll make sure to add on an additional 1/2 inch for my hem allowance. Now I want to measure all the way from the corner down to my mark. And mine is about 20 1/4 inches. Now we're going to take our magic number, in my case 20 1/4 inches, and we're going to start at that corner, and we're going to go a few inches from my last mark. Make sure it's nice and straight and mark 20 1/4 inches. And I'm going to repeat that over and over until I'm all the way to the other straight edge of the skirt. That pen was really hard to see, so I went back with a marker and I made some dots. The next step is to connect the dots. So the dots themselves sort of follow that curved line of our circle, and you want to do the same thing when you're connecting them. If you do straight lines in between the dots, you'll probably wind up with a dodecahedral skirt instead of a circle skirt, and nobody wants that. Now we can go ahead and cut this out. While I'm cutting, we'll talk a little bit about fabric. You remember our magic number? In my case, it's 20 1/4 inches. You want to multiply that number by 2. So for me, that's 40 1/2 inches. If I want to be able to cut my circle skirt out in one continuous piece, I need my fabric to be 40 1/2 inches wide and 40 1/2 inches long. Length is less of a concern because you can buy the appropriate yardage, but the width of the fabric, of course, is what it is. If it's 44 inches, it's 44 inches. You can't change that. Particularly if you're trying to do a very long circle skirt, you're probably going to have to cut it out in more than one piece. If that's the case, in a few minutes, I'll explain not only how to cut it out, but also how to determine what yardage you need. So here's our handy dandy circle skirt template. And now we're ready for our fabric. Remember your magic number, and you multiplied it by 2. In my example case, it's 40 1/2 inches. I want a square of fabric, 40 1/2 inches long and 40 1/2 inches wide. So here's my square of fabric. Now you want to fold it in half. If you have wrinkles, smooth them out or iron them if necessary. You want the corners and the raw edges all lined up. Once you get it pretty much perfect, we're going to fold it in half again the other way. And again, get all those corners and raw edges all lined up. Now what you should have is something that looks a little bit like this. So now we have a square with a fold on this side, another 2 folds over here, and then the other 2 sides of our square have raw edges. Now we transfer our template to our fabric. Make sure the side of your template with the waist cut out is the side you're lining up with the 2 folded edges of your square. If you line that part of the template up with any of the raw edged sides, you'd end up not cutting it in one continuous piece. So as you can see, I'm marking mine first, then I'll move on to cutting. And now it's starting to look like a circle skirt. So along our waist edge, we want to mark the 4 folds. You can use pins or a fabric marker, it's up to you. When you're finished marking the circle skirt, you can set it aside and we'll focus on the waistband. I highly recommend you use some sort of spandex knit for the waistband. I personally like a cotton spandex blend, but the spandex is the important part. It's also known as lycra, and if it doesn't have spandex or lycra in it, the fabric will have a tendency to stretch out of shape and the waistband won't fit you anymore. We want to go back to our waist measurement. So for my example, it's 32 inches, and I want to subtract 4 inches. It sounds like a lot, but trust me. So I want 28 inches. Remember to add seam allowances, so we'll say 28 1/2. The waistband gets folded over, so I want a 2-inch waistband, that's 4 inches. plus seam allowances is 4.5 inches. So just to recap, your waistband is going to be 4.5 inches wide, and the length of your waist minus 4 inches. Here's my waistband that I've already cut out, and you want to fold it in half, right sides together. And then you're going to sew the seam with a zigzag stitch or a serger, like so. So now we essentially have our waistband sewn into a big loop, and what we want to do now is fold it in half lengthwise. So working around the whole waistband, you want to line up the raw edges and pin them together. So here's my waistband all folded and pinned, and I want to find the seam and mark it with a pin or a fabric marker. Now if I mark the other end as well, I've divided my waistband into 2 perfect halves. So now I'm going to line those marks up, and I'm going to mark each end again, which basically has divided my waistband into 4 equal parts, and this is called quarter marking. So here we have our quarter marked waistband, and we're going to go ahead and grab our circle skirt. And you can see how the marks on our waistband and the marks we made on our circle skirt are going to line up just about perfect. So now we can start pinning the skirt to the waistband. And of course you want to pin right sides together. So I start at each quarter mark and line up the marks on the skirt with the mark on the waistband. And once you get the 4 quarter marks lined up and pinned, you can start adding more pins in between. To get the waistband to match up with the circle skirt, you might have to stretch it a bit while you pin. That's perfectly alright. So here's our skirt with the waistband pinned all the way around. And now we're going to sew the 2 pieces together. If you're using a regular sewing machine, use a zigzag stitch, or you could use a serger. Now if you had to stretch the waistband while you pinned, you're going to need to stretch the waistband again while you sew. Stretching the waistband would be a lot easier if you sewed with the waistband on top. For some reason I decided to sew this upside down. So here's our finished seam, and if we flip it right side out, you can see that we're getting pretty close to being done. If you're a true perfectionist, you want to let your circle skirt hang for a few days before hemming. Hanging allows the bias of the fabric to stretch out. If you don't let it hang, the sides of your skirt might wind up being a slightly different length than the front and back. If you do let it hang before you hem, remeasure the skirt and trim as needed. Now it's time to hem. I like a single fold 1/2 inch hem. So the trick to pressing the hem of a circle skirt is to not do it like this. If you try to press in these big long straight edges on a curved hem, you wind up getting weird little corners and bumps. What you want to do instead is work in small portions at a time. And instead of sort of rubbing the iron back and forth, which can have a tendency to stretch the fabric out, lift it up, press it down, and then lift it up again. Just do little small movements like that. And as you can see, that gives us a nice curved edge, and you can pin it as well, or you can just press. When you're done pressing, it's time to hem. I'm going to sew about 3/8 of an inch from the edge, and I'm using a zigzag stitch for my example, but you could use a straight stitch or a cover stitch, whatever you want. And here is my finished hem. And that's it. We made a circle skirt. Congratulations. So now that you've mastered the circle skirt, here are some sneaky circle skirt tips. If you don't want to hem the circle skirt, you can trim it with lace. Lace that's about 1 inch wide or less works best because it can follow the curve of the edge. If you want to use wider lace, you'll need to buy pre-gathered lace, or you'll need to gather or pleat the lace yourself, like so. So now let's talk fabric. The easiest kind of print to use when you're making a circle skirt is one that looks the same from every direction. For example, polka dots or leopard print. This cherry print would be a good option because as you can see, some of the cherries are upside down and some are right side up. Now this apple print on the other hand is going to look great in the front where the apples are right side up, but the back the apples would be upside down. That doesn't mean you can't work with a one-way print. Instead of cutting the skirt in one seamless piece like I already showed, we'll cut 2 halves and sew them together. So here's a little sample so you can see how it works. And the only thing you need to remember is to add seam allowances to each half. Now here's what to do if your fabric isn't wide enough to cut your skirt in one piece. Let's say instead of 20 1/4, our magic number is 38. Multiply that by 2 and you're going to have a hard time finding any fabrics that are 76 inches wide. So instead you'll need to divide your skirt into 4 quarters. And to figure out how much fabric you need, take your magic number and multiply it by 4. For our example, that gives us 152 inches, which we divide by 36 inches to get about 4 1/4 yards. Remember when you're cutting out your quarters to add seam allowances to each side, and then you assemble the skirt by sewing each side together. And then when you're ready to attach to a waistband, make sure that you offset the seams so you don't have a seam running right down the center of your skirt. That's it, Grasshopper. I've taught you all of my secrets. Go forth and make circle skirts, and don't forget to visit whatthecraft.com for tips, tutorials, and kick-ass sewing patterns.